so far, that's just an overview about sort of how to think about metadata, how to go about starting a project. I'm going to circle back, though, to the main topic of sharing. As soon as you've made a decision to share, you have kind of de facto made a decision to license your information. So you need to kind of consciously think about what that means for your organization. And then the sharing implies that it's not just you that you're sharing it with, you're sharing with other people, so you sort of have to get the word about your product. And so we'll talk a little bit about those two things next. Like I mentioned on the last slide, deciding that you want to share your data is the first step in deciding you want to share the data is a de facto decision to put some sort of license for other people to use on it. So if you're from a federal organization, most likely you put all your data out in the public domain. So that's not much of a license. That's people can do whatever they want with it. In fact, public domain data, you can actually take it and relicense it and claim it as your own and do other things without even crediting the original organization if you don't want to. But most people want some sort of credit, and so that's a form of licensing that you put on there. Say, please credit SCORP, or please credit Oregon Coastal Zone Management Program. Besides taking that decision to share and to license it, you want to make sure that when it's out there in the world that it's well presented. So you want it to be documented with things like a great title that explains what it is. I usually go through an example when I'm telling people who do GIS data, why some of the defaults in software are bad. And an example would be working on a bird data set. My data set is called Birds 7 or something like that because I've been working on it for 6 months and this is the 7th month. Birds 7 is a terrible name for a data set. Being more specific, like calling it, Seabirds 7 is a little bit better, but it should probably be, more specific than that. It should probably be like seabirds of the Oregon coast or seabirds of X. Tell me something about what is in the data. Or where the data is relevant to. And then I tend to like, and not everybody does this, but I tend to like to know where the data came from by looking at the title. So I like to say, comma nanus, or comma DLCD, so that the source is right there in the title. And I also like to know how old it is, so I always would just put a year on my data set title. Just so that people, when they come up in search results, they're vaguely descriptive. And then, of course, I think titles are one of the places where people sometimes are weakest. Think of a title as a tiny little mini abstract that might appear in a list of search results. People are pretty good at writing informative abstracts usually, because usually they have to do this for their other documentation. But make sure that the abstract really is an abstract and not just like you copy the whole report into the abstract. It has to really be an abstract. Put a little attention to that. Obviously, most people want credit for their organization, so most people don't mess that up. But part of that is also pointing people to the right people within your organization. So if there's a PI that is particularly identified with a data set, make sure that PI is in there. If the data is accessible via the web in any sort of way that you can get to with a URL, either as a data service or as a data download or something like that, make sure those URLs are in there. And then kind of circling back up to the idea of the license, if there's any caveats for how the data should be used, be it accrediting the organization that created it or not to be used for navigation, those caveats should be well documented in metadata. These are the things that when you send your data off into the world, when you're not around to supervise it, it presents itself well and is least likely to be misused. And then we get into the sort of advertising part of the equation. You've documented your metadata. Where do you set it free? You can register your information with Google. People do that. You can literally have Google crawl your information. That's one way to share your data. Most people in domains like ours have networks within within which they're sharing with like-minded partners or people interested in similar data. And so if you're part of a network like this one, use the network. If you only have a few data sets to share and you need a home for them, maybe somebody in the network has a catalog that you can register your data sets with. If you have a lot of data, you probably have started to think about hosting your own catalog. This is a slight digression, but this is probably the best place for this slide. We wanted to talk a little bit about levels of sharing because maybe that's something that people hadn't thought about before. I mentioned already the idea that one of the first phases of sharing is opening your data with some sort of a license that you've documented. This concept of levels of sharing, it comes from a talk by Tim Berners-Lee. And I mean, you can see it's been commodified. You can buy mugs with it on. But it's still, it's designed to talk about any data on the web. But it's applicable to geospatial data, I think, to a certain degree. And most of us are on this spectrum somewhere, from doing a little bit of sharing to doing a lot of sharing. Most of us probably are never going to get to this high level of sharing anytime soon. But it's useful to know that the spectrum exists. Because it kind of helps point the way towards what might be next for your organization. So if you know you're here, you go, okay, I've opened my data, I've put everything in PDFs on the web, I'm done. You know, well, the next thing that's going to happen is someone's going to say, hey, I found this PDF on your website, it's awesome. Can I get it in a machine-readable format? So machine-readable formats are the next thing. You know? And then the third phase is, well, you gave it to me, but it was in Microsoft Excel, and I don't have Excel, you know, so is there a format you can give it to me that it's not proprietary? And on down the spectrum. At the tail end of this process, you're opening up your data such that everything in your data has an identifier and can be pointed to by other people's data. So for an example, I tried to think of an example that might be, an example of this from Oregon, and the best I could come up with was we're working on a data set right now to do with shorelines and shoreline segments. And one of the big needs is that the data, we've gone through a process where we've segmented the shoreline by geology or by geomorphology and by biology. But there's a big need in the response community to segment it by response units. And these things are kind of linked, like they don't want people to respond like over a cliff, for example. So, coming up with unique identifiers for shoreline segments is an example of linking items inside a data set so that other people who with other needs can link to the same segment of shoreline for a totally different purpose. And I think that would be the closest that I could think of an example from a coastal or marine data set that I've been working with. That's kind of at this end of the spectrum. But the idea is just to be aware that this continuum is out there.